Okay, great. Alicia?
Hi, everyone. I'm Alicia Zakhoff. I am the Sustainability Manager for the city and help participating in all these meetings and supporting all of my awesome team who are putting on this planning process. So glad to be here.
Rob?
Rob Jones, Executive Director, Groundwork RVA, Youth Training and Development, Climate Equity, Climate Justice, largely focused on Black and Brown youth.
Excellent. Thank you. Maggie?
Maggie Hopkins. I'm an environmental engineer and planner for a small consulting firm called AKRF, and I'm also on the Richmond Green City Commission.
Thank you. Parker?
Thank you. Greetings. My name is Parker Agelasto. I'm the Executive Director for the Capital Region Land Conservancy, which is a local land trust helping to put permanent conservation easements on parks, open space, and other working lands.
Excellent. Thank you. Carla?
Hi, everybody. I'm Kyla Logan. I'm with the City of Richmond Sustainability Office. I'm a management and GIS analyst for the office. So I'm doing a lot of the mapping work for this project and data related work. I'm working with the environment group as well as the community group.
Excellent. Thank you, Kyla. And yeah, and as I said, my name is Marshall Diobalkin, an independent consultant formerly with Integral Group, been working with the City of Richmond on some of these efforts for the past few years. So let's dive in. Thank you, everyone, for doing the introductions. I hate that it becomes sort of a me calling on exercise, but you know, you kind of need that for this. But I don't want that to, I want to say I don't want that to create an expectation. If you have a thing to say, please just speak up and share it. And you are welcome to do so. So everyone should have had the Scott and the survey link in the chat, if you see that. And please do open that, and then I will bring up some things. Kyla, I also can't share my screen. Can you? Do you have the power to make me a co-host?
Let me double check real quick and see if I do have that.
Otherwise, I'm just going to ask you to. I'll just ask you to share, and I can ask you to walk through stuff.
I do not have the ability to make you a co-host. Do you need me to share the PowerPoint slides?
Yes, yeah, share the PowerPoint slides starting on slide 20, starting on slide 33.
Can you add it to the chat for me?
Yep, will do.
Thank you.
Make sure this is the right. Clearly, it's a Monday, everyone. There you go.
Yeah. You said 23, correct?
Yep. 33.
33, sorry.
Thank you, Kyla. Appreciate it.
No problem.
So this will be the asset groups that we'll be going through in sequence. The first is stormwater and sewer infrastructure. We'll be looking. This is looking at the wastewater treatment plant, stormwater outfalls, discharge points, pump stations, pipes, sewer outfalls, same, and dams. I'm very much concerned here with the impact of increased storms on increased sewer outfalls and the combined sewer overflow. And then we'll talk about water supply infrastructure, water pipes in the water treatment plant, then trees and vegetation, tree canopy and vegetation pervious surface cover, and then Chesapeake Bay protection area, and then protected areas and habitats, including Chesapeake Bay protection areas, creeks, lakes, and water bodies, James River and the islands within it, and terrestrial habitat, and then finally starting with green, finishing up with green community spaces, parks and public spaces, community gardens, and cemeteries. So we'll start. next slide, please. This is a map just to sort of give people a sense, if you're not familiar with it, of the sort of the pinkish area is the area covered by the combined sewer overflow. So I think everyone knows what that is, but yeah, basically if the stormwater and sewer goes into the same pipes there and overflows about 2 to 5+ times a month into the river. This is a common fact in old cities up and down the eastern seaboard, and always an issue that we need to be dealing with. And I am aware there's ongoing work in the city on the stormwater infrastructure. This is not intended to replace that work, just complement it and try to bring more of a climate impact on that. Next slide. Again, keep this just things to keep in mind. We're looking for your discussion, your judgment based on your own knowledge and lived experience, not getting into the weeds so much on, particular like street intersections, for example, but, always happy to meet later for further input. This is not so much bogged down by what will happen. This is a partially hypothetical exercise. Hypothetical, not that this stuff isn't going to happen, but we're focused on, if it happens to this piece of infrastructure, what is the impact? Next. So we'll jump back and forth across these 3 slides throughout, but let's start with stormwater and sewer infrastructure, looking at the wastewater treatment plants, stormwater outflows, sewage outflows, and so forth. Looking here at sensitivity, want people to sort of consider what are the climate impacts that are stressing this asset now? So where have there been issues in the past? What impacts might we see more in the future? And what further stress is the asset going to see? If you've opened the survey, I hope everyone has opened the survey. If you're having trouble opening the survey, please chime in and let us know. You'll see it's asking for a scoring from high to moderate to low for both heat threats and water threats based on these grounds. But here we're asking for sort of share your thoughts. And Kyla, are you able to take notes while sharing your screen, or do I need to take on more of a note taking if you're sharing your screen?
I should be able to take notes. Just can you let me know real quick if you can see this panel on the right side?
Nope.
Okay, then that's perfect.
Great.
I can take notes and share my screen.
Okay, cool. Excellent. Just wanted to double check that. Thank you. So any thoughts on the stormwater system in Richmond and climate sensitivity?
Well, this is one area that seems to be like changing very rapidly. In that the RVA H2O program seems to be adding new capacity to, mitigate the issues with overflow events, combined sewer outflow events. But I'd say based on the last like 10 years, the sensitivity of existing climate impacts is substantial. With anything over an inch of rain in an hour or a few hours, tends to send the system into a combined sewer outflow system or combined sewer overflow event. So then superimposing on that, any more flashy type precipitation events, I feel like those like a flashier, more substantial rainfall events, would put in my opinion, this particular asset under a very high sensitivity score.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think, some of those outfalls are downstream on the river, where as sea levels rise, the outfalls themselves are gonna be underwater for longer or under a higher water differential, which then just takes up more capacity in the system.
That was my concern as well.
You see those as not as they're not working if they're underwater, just they're sort of, because they're partially flooded, they're just gonna, they have the outflow effectively is happening up within the pipe as opposed to out of it.
They work less well. So it's not to say that they don't work at all, but it means you need sort of even more water pressure on the upland side to actually force water out, which just causes more and potentially longer backups in the stormwater system.
That's a critical point. Thank you. And yeah, as we said, we do anticipate there will be some sea level rise impacts on the sort of tidal part of the river south of the
Right.
falls. So do you, one question here is, so this is an area where there is ongoing investment and effort, but the impacts are also getting increasing and fast. And Jeremy, I think you're very much right to bring up the question of, as you put it, flashy, but you know, high amounts of precipitation, a very tight time window, is something we're going to see more and more of with climate impacts, and it's going to really stress the system here. So then the question, I guess, is the level of investment that's going in sufficient to sort of keep pace even with where we are, or are we sort of falling behind?
Well, I think one answer to that question is like where further development is occurring and whether that expands the kind of like urban bullseye of impervious surface expansion. So like if it, you know, most of the land cover change in the region has occurred at the peripheral of the urban area, and very little investment is going towards like de-paving existing built out infrastructure, except for in limited individual areas. So to me, it seems like while that additional capacity might work for, you know, design storms in previous decades, like a design storm for 2050 might consistently overwhelm even those initial or those expanded infrastructure investments. So I think of it as like, even though they're adding capacity in these like holding areas and that sort of thing, there's not quite enough additional. It's like one, you know, it's like a 1% solution that needs like 99% in other places. And so I think of it as like, if we're not doing things to restrict what funnels the rainwater to make those flashier events even flashier in the sense of the in the surface flow, then it's like a drop in the bucket, pun intended.
Jeremy, I'll add on just a teeny bit, because I'm not sure that we're doing a very good job of capturing what additional imperviousness and sort of stormwater additives we're doing as we develop, right? So on the one hand, we're adding capacity, which we're measuring, but I'm not sure that we've got a full picture in terms of what the additional inputs are looking like as we expand, right? So it's hard to measure, you know, even if it's a 1% or if it's a 5% or a 10%, but clearly you don't have the data tools necessary to be able to map as we move forward, and that's a bit of a concern.
Yeah, and some, I mean, there are some projections of future land use, but just like the climate models, you know, it's got a range of potential future, you know, and we do have like the last few years of land surface change that we can track, but yeah, without there being large-scale investments in removing existing impervious surface as well, any additional just worsens the existing, you know, runoff.
I'd like to highlight something else here, which, you know, goes to the equity issue, and we're talking about combined sewer overflow, and I'm not so sure that that's all that we can address when so much of South Richmond doesn't have a CSO, and it relies on a separate network, mostly of natural resources, which are privately owned, not even under city control, to filter out this water. And that's, I think, a major component that we are failing to recognize might have a greater sensitivity to these rain events.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Because if there's not a combined sewer is a concern for overflow, but at times when there's not so overflow, if a separated sewer system means that the stormwater goes straight into the river with everything it picks up and all the runoff that it picks up off that. So, can you talk, Parker, a little more? What do you mean about the reliance on private resources to filter?
So when you
he doesn't
think
even
about
control the stormwater flow there.
No, most of the rivers and creeks and corridors are on land that's privately owned. DPU doesn't control it. Therefore, DPU can't necessarily impact anything in terms of mitigation in those corridors. And so there's got to be some way to work more collaboratively. But a lot of landowners reject DPU's efforts. And we've seen this with a number of instances. And so, frankly, I think that there needs to be some other solution presented. And following legislation, we've submitted comments on the new REGI program, the Community, Flood Investment Fund, to see if maybe that couldn't provide some funding for DPU to acquire some of these flood-prone areas that are basically our rivers and our creek corridors.
Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing up that additional area of sensitivity. The other one I'm curious about, if people have thoughts on, is the wastewater treatment plant. Not to name names, but when we had the energy and buildings working group, there was some degree of, I felt, complacency. I can say this, I'm an independent consultant, I could just say what I think. Complacency around the sensitivity of the wastewater treatment plant to flooding impacts. And curious if anyone has looked at or thoughts on that question, or maybe a different perspective there.
I haven't worked on this wastewater treatment plant specifically, but I work on a lot of them in other cities. And it's a pervasive issue. You know, they're inherently at sort of the low point in the system. And to really do anything systemic to rectify that is a tremendous investment. And I can't think of a city that has really figured it out.
Yeah, I mean, there's usually have to be some flood barriers, but
right.
People will be like, oh yeah, the flood barriers work, but just because they've worked in the past doesn't mean they're going to work in the future.
Right, yeah, and it has to be an ongoing and continuous investment to continue to adapt those. Complacency is unfortunately sort of the industry practice because it is a pretty inherent challenge.
Absolutely.
And I'll raise my hand and say that while I don't have, the data to back it up, I am quite concerned about what happens when the water rises and the things get backed up. And I'm also quite concerned because guess what? It's also on South Side, right? And it's also right in the smack dab middle if it, ceases to function. Here again, impacted communities are the ones that will suffer at the highest level.
Absolutely.
So I will say the Alliance is working with the city right now on creating a green infrastructure master plan. And we are specifically focused on the 3 priority watersheds just to make it a little bit easier on what to focus on. And we have started having workshops. We have another one this week with city departments to kind of get everyone talking together so that from now on, if a new median goes in, can we make that median, some kind of add some green infrastructure practices to it? Or if a new parking lot goes in, can we, add a rain garden or trying to get everyone to start thinking on the same page because this is an issue. And it's just one of those things that can hopefully help the upgrades that are being made to the wastewater treatment plant, stopping before it gets there.
Thank you.
I don't know, stay tuned for that. It's been an interesting discussion. It's been hard to get buy-in from everyone in all the departments just to kind of show up, but it's starting to happen. And we have a really good list of people coming to our meeting on Thursday. So stay tuned. But that's just for city-owned lands.
Christina, thank you for raising that. And Carla, can we move to the next slide? Because I think this really ties, I want to sort of pivot. We're already sort of here talking about adaptive capacity. So adaptive capacity of the asset is impacted by extreme heat and flooding. Can the infrastructure adjust without modification or cost? And does it require substantial modification? And so here we've already been talking a little bit about the limited adaptive capacity. And one thing I sort of I appreciate you bringing up the green infrastructure point, because I think what a lot of cities are seeing, and I know when I was in DC, what we were really seeing was, the need to have solutions and address the system upstream, as it were, of the sewer pipes in terms of the amount of stormwater overflow that's allowed. And so, in DC has new stormwater guidelines that require any new development to retain 1.2 inches of water on site, which is a fairly hefty stormwater retention requirement, and has, gotten, you might imagine the amount of community pushback it's gotten, but it does seem to be helping somewhat. I'm curious what is being done in Richmond around not just, I think, removal of impervious surface, but also in terms of retention.
Well, I will say on that project we're working on, RVA H2O, which is Richmond Stormwater Utility, they are our partner on that project. So we are working hand in hand on that specific, oops, sorry, hit mute, on that specific project in the three priority watersheds.
Just a clarifying question as we score in the survey, something like adaptive capacity, where there are great ways to be more adaptive, like the Green Infrastructure Master Plan, but they're not in place now. We're scoring as it exists now, right?
Precisely. So that would be low. Low capacity. Yeah, because this isn't a question of sort of, are there ways to adapt? It's sort of taken as a given in this exercise that there are ways to adapt to a lot of these things. It's a question of, which, is that's a side point. We could discuss at length, but the question is sort of what's being done, what exists right now in Richmond, either in plans that are being implemented or have already been done in terms of the capacity of a system to adapt as is.
And maybe so that we're all on the same page, what time frame are we referring to in terms of adaptability?
Yeah, apologies for that. The time frame we're looking at here, and there's a map that I don't know if Kyla has if you have the map open to show. We're looking out to like 2020, at least 2070, so the next 50 years. So in a lot of when we've been talking about flooding, we've been looking at out to 2070, which was the 500-year floodplain, considered to be a potential floodplain out in the late century. Does that answer your question?
And I say this only because I know that there are communities that are already planting trees that take a warmer climate to thrive, and are stopping to plant other trees that they know just won't thrive with climate increases. And a tree takes a very long time to mature to establish the kind of canopy that we wish to install.
Absolutely. And we'll talk about trees a little bit more in a little bit. But yes, so we're looking out to mid to late century here. Kyla, can you go on? Go ahead.
I would just say that like plans and like tools are nice and everything, but like in my appraisal of this is that it has no real policy bite to it whatsoever. So in my appraisal is very low. We don't have any idea where the money's going to come from. A few people planting trees of a certain cultivar for the future. That's like not nearly as much as the amount of paving that's going on outside of the peripheral, and and definitely not enough to accommodate future, overland flow in any way. So it's just my opinion is a very less than one.
Yeah.
But we're dealing with both water and heat threats, right?
Yeah, that was the other thing I was about to ask, which is I think we've mostly talked about water threats, which is the natural place for the mind to go when we talk about water, stormwater infrastructure and flooding. What about heat? Are there any concerns that people in this group have about the increased sensitivity of the wastewater system and stormwater system to increased heat?
Warmer water is, like a more conducive petri dish for various forms of waterborne bacteria and virus colonies. Now I understand that stuff doesn't usually hang around for very long, but also the hotter the pavement is, the hotter the runoff is into local streams and rivers in the first flush. And that can really overwhelm, colder water species that might call those streams and rivers home. So as far as the infrastructure, I don't necessarily see the connection between heat extremes and the infrastructure. I would love to hear it from someone that's more knowledgeable.
To be honest, even that I would say is worth highlighting, either as sort of a moderate risk or moderate sensitivity, or in the comments, because I think that so ties into the question of consequence that we need to, since the consequence is not grouped by heat in this survey by heat versus water. I think we want to try to capture that.
Yeah, I would say that I think those are important to capture. The infrastructure itself is relatively insensitive to heat. I guess that's one of the benefits of having gray infrastructure still. As we transform to a more green stormwater infrastructure system, it's going to matter a lot. But as it is now, they're relatively steady in temperature.
Can you talk a little bit more about the way in which this transition to green infrastructure is more sensitive from the heat standpoint? Just the plants are more sensitive?
Yeah. A lot of the performance of green infrastructure depends on having healthy plants in whatever the system is, a bioswale or a green roof or anything like that. And as we have longer and more intense heat periods, we certainly at least need to account for those in designing those systems. It's not to say that it's impossible to overcome with the right plant selection, but it's an important factor.
That's important, very important to highlight as well. Before we move on to other talks, talking here, we've talked a little bit around the consequence. So you'll see in the survey asks to rate consequence on a number of different things, and I'm going to read them out here, but I won't read them out for every area. But we're looking here at area of service loss, so the geographic area of impact, duration of service loss, how long it takes to get back online, which high would be sort of a week or more. Low is a day or less, less than a day. I mean, cost of damage, how expensive is the damage here, and then really getting into the questions for people. There's a public safety for the impacts on the well-being of residents, workforce, and visitors. Their economic activities and economic impact, the public health impact. Particularly the impact on vulnerable populations that are already disproportionately impacted by inequities. Rob, I think your points on the communities living in the South Side, they're very, very, very important there and worth highlighting. And then this is the environment group, so the impacts on natural resources. Jeremy's point about impacts on cold water species being, a great example here. Are there other thoughts on consequence with regard to climate impacts on water and stormwater that people want to highlight?
I think when you look at the wastewater treatment plant, just in and of itself, the consequences of any further risk to that are pretty high across the board. And then when you add in increased frequency and duration of combined sewer overflows, really all of these across the board have a lot of pretty consistent high impacts.
Does anyone know if there's been a study done of sort of if the wastewater treatment plant were flooded, both the impacts of that on the community, and how long it would take to restore service and deal with it? Is that
Not that I know of.
okay? This is an important question. In DC, we found that if the wastewater treatment plant flooded, 3 million people would be without wastewater services for a substantial period of time. So.
Yeah, I don't know that that study's been done, but it certainly would be 2 or more council districts.
That's for sure.
And you know, it may not be a complete service loss for more than a week, but I would think that it's going to take way more than a week to bring the function completely back.
Cool. Apologies for somewhat of leading questions here. Any other thoughts on consequence here? Rob, I know you've been talking a lot about the impacts on the community. Any particular impacts that we haven't discussed here that we want to sort of bring out?
No, I mean, unfortunately, I'm just not sure that we've got the data necessary to, right? I mean, as it exists, I don't know that our capacity is even up to the growth that we're about to see. Mm-hmm. And so as soon as you start taxing that existing capacity beyond what growth is coming, it's hard to tell what's going to happen. It's not going to be good. It's about, the level of detail that I've got. It would probably wind up having a pretty severe impact on a lot of folks, but
yeah. This is not a scientific exercise. It's not going to be good, and the impact is potentially high, is, I think, sufficient. Certainly.
Well, that's what I put in my survey. So
there we go. All right. Any other thoughts? Okay, in the interest of time, I'm going to try to move us along. So we're going to move on here to, fill out your section of the survey. We're going to move on talking about water infrastructure. Here we're talking about water pipes and the water treatment plant. Kyla, can we just jump back to sensitivity? We're going to do this with each of the things. I just want to sort of keep this up in people's. So in terms of thinking here about the supply of drinking water and potable water, to Richmond residents in terms of the water pipes and the water treatment plant. Thoughts on sensitivity there. Again, the water treatment plant, like the wastewater treatment plant, also very close to the river. No one has thoughts on sensitivity of the water system?
I think it's quite sensitive to heat threats, assuming that those heat threats are accompanied by drought periods, which Jeremy, you can probably speak to that better than I can. There's increased demand and also decreased supply.
Yeah. The drought signal isn't particularly strong here, but the idea of flashy rainfall events suggests times of very strong drought. So it's just more of an implication than it is like a very strong future in the climate models, at least. But I don't know if, does anybody have experience with that in the past? Like has there been a time where there's been boil orders? As far as I've lived here, which is 5 years, we've never had an issue with the, water system that in my part of the city, which is Scott's Addition. But if someone else has lived here for quite a long time and recalls times when there have been drastic boil orders, or any sort of rationing. We were very close. The governor almost did some rationing last summer or 2 summers ago, but I just don't remember that being something leading me to think that it's a lower sensitivity than the stormwater infrastructure. I remember back in the 90s, wasn't there some that was like sewer systems backing up into Northside houses and stuff. It's not so much like water supply though, is it?
I don't think so.
Yeah, this is Alicia. So I grew up in the Richmond area and lived in the city for quite a long time. So I don't recall, I recall, like, I don't remember the exact years, but I would say like once or twice over the last maybe 10, maybe 15 years being where there's been a point where people were, asked to sort of not water lawns and things, but not ever to the point where it's been like rationing in terms of boiling water or anything like that. So
yeah, the drought from a quantity perspective, like don't wash your cars, don't walk, right? That's one side of the coin. But in terms of the ability of the water treatment plant to make water that's potable for us, I haven't experienced that here. It is low lying, right? So who knows what happens in high water kinds of situations? I don't know, but I think I'm probably, of the 2 systems, I'm more concerned about wastewater than I am about water treatment at the moment.
Yeah, we've got good supply. This is Parker. The only thing that I would caution against is that we've got to keep our eye upriver. Not Chesterfield, Henrico and Cumberland County have gone into a joint agreement to withdraw water further up the James River, which is our primary water supply. And the main concern that we could have is if more supply is taken from the river before it reaches Richmond, we could find ourselves in some precarious situations. Chesterfield County now is getting its water from, I think, at least 3 different suppliers.
Yeah, the water treatment plant is within the floodplain, but I don't know what level of protections it has on, similar to the wastewater plant. So thing to look at, I suppose.
Alicia, didn't your it was like a urban flood map that was just put out by your office? Is that part of the equity map portal?
Well, I think I need to know exactly what you're referring to, but most likely if our office put it out, it's probably on and it's a map. Kyla, can I ask Kyla? Kyla may know.
He said the urban flood map.
Yeah, it was like a future flood map of the river.
Yeah. Kyla, would you be able to pull up the map that I know was in like Brianne's email this morning, or any of the various maps you have made that have the 2030, 2050, and then the 2070 flood plain maps on them? Those are very useful.
Yeah, and if it's those maps, yeah, Jeremy, we did those maps, but hopefully we can look at them so we're confirming we're all talking about the same thing.
Well, and wasn't there some discussion that the floodplain maps were being revised recently?
And are you referring at the national level, Parker?
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah.
What can you currently see on the screen? I'm sorry.
Can you hide the filters, and then we could see it pretty well if you hide the filter boxes. I mean, there we go. So yeah, Kyla, do you want to explain what they're looking at? Because you made this. I usually do that.
Yeah. So I actually need to pull up this one. Right now, the only thing that's up is the 2030, 2050 flood scenario and the 2070 flood scenario. The 2030, 2050 flood scenario is actually the 100-year floodplain, and the 2070 is the 500-year floodplain. In color, the red is where the 2070 is, and the orange is the 2030. Just keep in mind that if I turn this off, it's overflowing, so it's just a layer underneath, which is why you can only see part of the red when the 2030 is on. Is this the layer you were referring to, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think so. Maybe I dreamt it. You know, I dream about climate change, so maybe I'm just making this up.
Yeah, it's a useful map, and I think, you know, the both the wastewater treatment plant and the water treatment plant are under the orange here. This is, and to Parker's question about the flood maps, my understanding is yes, the national flood maps are being updated, the FEMA flood maps are being updated. So both the 100-year and 500-year floodplains would be expanded further than this potentially quite likely in the future. Jeremy found another.
Yeah, it's just, I think on your Instagram, you had overlaid the council districts.
Yes, this is the same thing.
Yeah, it is the same thing.
Yeah. So I put a link
like where the wastewater treatment plant overlays on this map.
Can
Do you have
use it?
that?
Yeah, I can. Guy, I wish I could. It's not on the map there, Kyla. But if you zoom in, I wish I could share my screen.
Do you have
here.
the address?
No, but I can tell you where it is.
Is it 1400 Brander Mill or Brander?
Brander, I think it's Brander Street.
Yeah, Brander Street. So it's in the both flood scenarios.
Yes, it is.
So maybe that's a moderate risk for the future then, or moderate sensitivity.
What about in terms of the capacity of the system to adapt, and then like what about the consequence? I think we can. I want to sort of conscious of time here. Kyla, can you bring back up the consequence slide? So again, thinking about the water system before we move on to talking about trees, any additional thoughts we want to share about the consequence for this, for vulnerable populations, public health, economic activity of disruptions on the water system and water supply side?
And this is a hard exercise, right? Because we're going out 30, 40, 50 years, and there's no way to sort of account for what we're going to do to try and harden these systems, right? But I mean, obviously, if the water treatment plant goes down or is impacted, everybody that can't afford to buy bottled water is up a creek, right? And we'll have potable water, and we'll be in a situation where the National Guard is bringing in water trucks and things like that, like we have seen in natural disasters in a variety of different circumstances. But it's difficult to, I mean, we just popped up that the wastewater treatment plant is in the floodplain, right? But sure, if I sit here and I twiddle my thumbs for the next 50 years, the world's gonna end,
Right. Rob, I mean, I think your point is very valid here, and I think that's where sort of I'd go back to sort of the thing that part of what we're trying to do here is highlight risks and priorities. There's a lot Richmond is going to need to do to address the risks of climate over the next 50 years, and unfortunately, everything Richmond could do for every possible risk is probably not going to happen. And so I think part of what we're trying to do here is say, oh yeah, this would be really, really bad. And that helps guide prioritization. Even so, yeah, we are looking at it. If action wasn't taken, what would the risk be? Even if it may seem self-evident that obviously action will be taken. If everywhere where action obviously should be taken had been taken, we would be in a different scenario with climate change overall. in the greater scale of things, if that's helpful. I don't know if that's helpful.
Okay, I mean, so then I mean, consequences is catastrophic across the board, right?
There we go.
It's pretty. I mean, that's a pretty. I mean, that's an easy thing to do, right? Because if that's what we're game, if that's what the, you know, we're game planning, then of course.
Yeah. All right. In the interest of time here, I'm gonna try to move us on. I know there was some desire. We have 20 minutes and still more to cover. So desire to talk. The next area would be trees and vegetation. So
we like trees and vegetation.
We like trees and vegetation. So here we're talking here about both the tree canopy of street trees and other trees, and vegetation pervious surface cover, and looking first at sort of the sensitivity of those assets to both heat and water threats. Parker, you were making some points about trees earlier, and I don't know if I ended up cutting you off there, but if you or anyone else wanted to chime in on this.
No, Jeremy's my tree expert.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, like there's so much about the rapidity, like how rapid, you know, the warming occurs, right? Worst case scenario is very bad for trees, so I always think that these natural assets are much less, especially new ones, you know, and thinking about young trees, which a lot of the trees in particular areas of the city are relatively young. Yeah, I mean, we see a lot
You mean
of
the new trees that have been planted to replace the older trees that we tore up to build things? Those trees, those are the ones we're talking about?
Yeah, those are extremely sensitive. So I think about, like, you know, I think about the majority of the trees, like in the West End and stuff, they create their own microclimate that's several degrees buffered from the rest of the city. I mean, they basically live in natural air conditioning. So it depends on like a few things. It's like I can't help but think about space and geography, you know, in this question. But I would consider it being for heat, like moderate sensitivity then, because that way we're acknowledging that some of the larger, older canopy trees are going to be just fine. Some of them won't be, especially younger and more exposed trees that are more higher sensitivity. I don't know. But then for the water, maybe it's a little bit of both. Moderate to high sensitivity, I think, is an appropriate estimation. But happy to temper my interpretation from others, especially Christina and folks that work with green infrastructure more directly.
I mean, I agree. When I think about this question, I sort of started thinking about it in the geography of the city too. It's like, whoa, are you talking about the concrete wasteland of Manchester, or are you talking about like Westover Hills? I think it really just, I don't know how to answer this one. Maybe it is just moderate because it sort of depends where.
I will chime in too. Again, much of the city's tree canopy is on private land, and the tree loss that we're seeing is predominantly on private land. And we're seeing the city begin to do more infill, going back into its parklands as well as its tree wells to add more trees, which are going to take some time. But I don't see us really turning this curve until we get a massive incentive program for private citizens.
We'll pocket that for the strategy discussions later. What about the ability of these trees to adapt? I mean, that it very much related to their sensitivity, but in terms of as they are impacted, what can be done to mitigate is there anything that can be done?
Marshall, I'm gonna jump in here because this is one place where it really does feel as if we've got to titrate this some. I mean, by geography, I mean, we have such different kinds of topography in our city, right? And different parts of the city are really much more vulnerable and sensitive than each other, and to sort of just treat the city trees as a thing, I think is not necessarily going to get us where we need to go. Even you know, in impacted neighbor, you know, I mean, within a half mile, you've got Gilpin Court that doesn't have any trees, and you've got Cannon Creek less than half mile up the road that's got trees, and those trees are likely to flood out in a you know, in a high rain event. I'm not sure what other folks, you know, however folks kind of do these kinds of measurements, but it feels like in our context, they're, I mean, they really are. It's hard. I mean, I want to just back up with, it's hard to talk about the trees.
I think
so, but you know.
Yeah. No,
Yeah,
Rob, you're absolutely right. And that's where, like, if we were in person here, we'd probably have a map and we could draw on the map and we could talk about it. And sort of, I think the virtual interface does make it a little bit harder to sort of gather that geographically specific feedback. But I think we really want to capture that both through discussion and what you put in the comments.
Yeah, and I would just add that even, you know, trees and other vegetative cover are lumped together, and those are totally different systems that react differently.
Yeah, and again, that's where we sort of were trying for the interest of time. But what about other vegetative cover? There's particular points you want to make there?
It's a pretty broad category,
I
as
know,
I understand
I
all of
know.
this is. Yeah, and I think that similarly varies across the city, but in probably different ways than the trees do.
I think all the grass should be killed off and replaced. So in that regard, I mean, European grasses have such low capacity.
I was going to say, what would you replace it with?
I mean, virtually any of
You don't want Kentucky bluegrass.
Anything else.
You want grasses that have a deep root system that are going
Yeah.
to drink more water.
Yes. So I mean, like turf grass has a very low adaptive capacity, right? I mean, like I would say that a lot of our natural, you know, landscapes have moderate to low adaptive capacity. If we're just thinking about it as like, you know, if we take 38% tree canopy as gospel, but with plus or minus 20% on either side by neighborhood, and then grass everywhere else, and turf grass. I mean, that's, you know, take your glasses off and look at a map from you know, 20 feet like looking down. Is like how I'm trying to imagine my answers to this.
I don't know if this is where we need to talk or if it's in strategies, but like with everything Jeremy's saying, natives, we need to make sure that they're native as well. Natives are adapted for our climate. I don't know if they'll be adapted for 2070 or not.
Right, for what's coming next.
Probably.
Yeah, that's also a place where you could look at taking what's native here, but also what's native, you know, in climate areas where the climate is much more like it's going to be in the next 50 years.
That's like Huntsville, Alabama, or whatever.
Somewhere in Tennessee, probably, at least.
Yeah,
Possibly
it's like
Alabama.
Yeah, it's like Alabama, Georgia, further southwest, closer to the Gulf.
Yeah. What about the consequence here? I mean, I feel like, especially in the context of equity, with the areas of the city that have such low tree cover, and the city's trying to add more trees, but if those trees are extremely vulnerable, that's an issue. What other consequence issues with the trees do we see? And vegetative cover.
Can you go back to your consequence slide?
Yeah. Kyla, can we do that?
I think this is like the duration of service loss is just on a totally different scale than the things we've been talking about so far. You know, this is a generation's worth of loss, basically. Yeah, it's certainly the vulnerable populations and public health aspects of them are tied up together for sure.
Someone's
The-
busy
the-
typing away their thoughts, and I appreciate that.
The literal cost. I was just doing the iTree analysis for the tree commission, trying to update our understanding. I actually have that estimate. If we like lost all of the trees, what that would end up being, all told, something like values in the order of $3 million a year just for air pollution. Plus or minus $500,000. So let's put it up at the upper limit, $4 million a year. Ugh.
And that's not
Devastating.
even the cost of replacing the trees. That's the air pollution.
That's
That's just air pollution.
That's just air pollution for the existing tree canopy percentage we have as estimated by iTree.
Right, which also doesn't take into account, which would probably be the larger figure, which is how do you treat all the people that are going to die of asthma, COPD, and the rest of it as that
Mhm.
So
pollution goes up and the heat index goes up, right? I mean,
cost is untenable.
until you think about COVID, right? And then all of a sudden it's tenable and it's fathomable because we're living in that. But you know,
This is why climate action we can make we can make climate act we can take serious action on climate because we've shown we can spend some huge large amounts of money when people recognize there's a need. But that's a really good perspective there. Thank you. Just conscious of time here, I realize there's 2 areas we still need to talk about. So quickly, I guess, protected areas and habitats, Chesapeake Bay protected areas, creeks, lakes, water bodies, the James River and the islands and other terrestrial habitat. Again, a whole set of different sorts of things, but any particular concerns around on the sensitivity and the ability of those systems to adapt?
Well, everything that's in the RMA and the RPA, I don't know about everything, but a lot of it was red and orange in that
right.
app. So extremely sensitive.
Yep.
Yeah, and we know that the heat is already, if we think about like these assets as the ecosystem that they support, the devastation to the native species, birds and fish and those sorts of aspects of the asset, and how that's been already shifted and documented, in the last 40 years. I would also consider it to be pretty high sensitivity to the heat changes as well.
And how do those sorts of systems adapt? What is the capacity of adaptation there? I mean, you can't just build a flood wall or on the whole natural protected area. That destroys the protected area in another way. So
basically, some of the adaptation that is happening, and there's beginning to be some mapping through VIMS, which is the Virginia Marine Science Institute. They are modeling where marsh grasses are going to begin to migrate due to sea level rise. And that has already started to get modeled into some of the adaptation of where this habitat will begin to migrate. And it may not already be in an RPA location, but it's going to begin to migrate due to the flood. And it's not really a floodplain issue. And it's not going to affect most of above the falls. It will be mostly below the falls, which frankly is going to, for the city, is really going to only be on the Ancaros down to, I guess, to the Chesterfield limits, though we got the port in there. The other thing that is also should be noted, at least on some of this, is there were islands in the river that got entirely removed over the last 400 years to make the river more navigable to the falls. And so some of that migration is perhaps not likely due to what will be found on the banks of the river.
I guess one other thing, I mean, if we're talking 30, 50, 70 years, we're looking at a pretty significant climate migration, right? We're gonna be an inflow site for folks from Tidewater and places like that. So all of a sudden, the level of impact that we're measuring in terms of the human footprint now on these systems is nowhere near what we're likely to be experiencing in the next 30, 50, or 70 years. Now, how one models that, I don't know. I mean, when we did, RVA Richmond 300, I mean, we looked out 30 years, and they had three different lines, I guess, for what climate refugees might look like. But cycling that impact into these kinds of scenarios, especially if you're looking at protected areas and habitats, seems like, again, we're modeling something that we don't have an impact to measure.
There's also a place where on the natural systems where there may be ways that, and this will getting as you can talk about strategies where improvement of natural systems can help buffer against some of the climate impacts with flooding, for example.
Yeah, I was just going to say that as we get to consequences, that the public safety impacts of some of these ecosystems being depleted are far-reaching.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think, Rob, that's a great point on the climate migration. And I think sort of back to something Marshall said initially, which is, I know this is a hard exercise and it can be somewhat frustrating just trying to project out so far ahead. But I think what we're really trying to do is just get a sense of relativity among the various assets in terms of the scale of impact, and so that we can start trying to prioritize and look at what do we need to try and address first. Where are the higher priorities in terms of assets that are potentially impacted more so than others, in terms of where are ones that have a higher consequence than others if they are impacted. So that's ideally what we're trying to get out of this exercise with you all and the other working groups, and knowing also that the plan, the roadmap that we're working on, big picture with everyone through this planning process, is really like a 5 to 7 year roadmap. And so we want to take all of this information back and then see like what can we do in the next short-term period, ultimately working out to that 2050 goal.
Yeah.
So I think maybe that may be helpful to keep in mind as well.
Thank you. So recognizing that we have, I believe Brianne says we have 2 minutes left to talk. So the last area we didn't really get to talk about a lot was around parks and open space and green space community spaces. So that's the final page of the survey. So plenty of place for people to put in their comments on that. But any final thoughts on that area that we want to that you'd want to share with everyone before they yank us out of this room?
I mean, I find myself just wanting to, I mean, I'm being repetitive and that's not helpful, but I mean, the making in places where people have their own backyards and the tree cover is adequate, it's a whole different conversation than in places where people don't have access to any green space, right? Yep. I mean, and that's what is underpinning this entire 2050 activity, is trying to bring some equity through mitigation efforts, right? So
then those areas need to be the focus areas.
Yeah, I keep finding myself, saying, yeah, we need to do what we say we're going to do, which is plant trees where there aren't any. And, but anyhow, it's just,
yeah,
it's a little hard again to be looking across the entirety of the system when you come to these questions, especially green and community space.
Yeah, I think what I would say to Rob to that is, I think we want to prioritize those areas that most need the help and don't have those resources. That's what community equity-based planning in this context partially means. Yeah. Any final thoughts? 10 seconds. I want to just thank you all for this. Has been a great conversation. And you know it's been a great conversation when you run out of time. Or you have a, well, I don't know about you, Brianne, but our